In a recent, not so publicized executive order, Donald Trump has told cities across the United States they need to eviscerate homeless camps and reinstitutionalize people with mental illness and substance abuse problems. I will tell you all about that and all of the insanity involved with such said executive order here on Fed Up in Minnesota. I'm Scott Schneider. On July 24th, 2025, Donald Trump issued an executive order basically criminalizing, targeting, and trying to eliminate homeless encampments in cities across the United States of America. Here's the executive order as he put it out straight from the White House website. Notice how the executive order is entitled Ending Crime and Disorder on America's Streets. Has nothing to do with homelessness. By the authority invested in me as president, I call him dictator, by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, it is hereby ordered. Yeah, you're not being run by the Constitution. You're run by your own Constitution. Section 1, Purpose and Policy, Endemic Vagrancy. Disorderly behavior, sudden confrontations, and violent attacks have made our cities unsafe. Now, who the hell is responsible for disorderly behavior, sudden confrontations, and violent attacks lately? It certainly isn't the homeless. The number of individuals living on the streets in the United States on a single night during the last year of the previous administration, 274,224, if we can believe the number, but it's Donald Trump, so he may have just pulled it out of his ass, was the highest ever recorded. Of course, you got to blame Biden for that too, right? The overwhelming majority of these individuals are addicted to drugs, have a mental health condition, or both. Nearly two-thirds of homeless individuals report having regularly used hard drugs like methamphetamines, cocaine, or opioids in their lifetimes. An equally large share of homeless individuals reported suffering from mental health conditions. Again, we have to take Donald Trump's word for it, which means absolutely nothing. The federal government and the states have spent tens of billions of dollars on failed programs that address homelessness, but not its root causes, leaving other citizens vulnerable to public safety threats. And in here lies the booby trap, calling them failed programs, which we will see in a few moments that they're not even close to failed programs. This is normal for Donald Trump. Stuff that's supposed to fail and is failing and will fail is lauded as being heroic, and stuff that's working is being torn down and destroyed. Homelessness, but not its root causes. Well, in reality, the root causes that Donald Trump thinks cause homelessness are not the things that are leading to and contributing to homelessness in this country, which is, again, not unusual for MAGA and for the Donald Trump dictatorial regime. Shifting homeless individuals into long-term institutional settings for humane treatment through the appropriate use of civil commitment will restore public order. Oh, you mean like the ICE detention centers. Surrendering our cities and citizens to disorder and fear is neither compassionate to the homeless nor other citizens. Tell that to the migrants that ICE is terrorizing and kidnapping off of our streets. Thank you. My administration will take a new approach focused on protecting public safety. It's not a new approach. The approach that you're taking is going way back in the Wayback Machine to when people like Donald Trump didn't think that homeless people were anything but lazy hobos who'd like to sit around and ride boxcars all day because they're too lazy to get a job. And we'll see that that's not the case again. Section 2, Restoring Civil Commitment. The Attorney General, in consultation with Secretary of Health and Human Services, Freak Show, RFK Jr., shall take appropriate action to seek, in appropriate cases, the reversal of federal or state judicial precedents and the termination of consent decrees that impede the United States policies of encouraging civil commitment of individuals with mental illness who pose risks to themselves or the public or are living on the streets and cannot care for themselves in appropriate facilities for appropriate periods of time. Provide assistance to state and local governments through technical guidance, grants, or legally available means for the identification, adoption, and implementation of maximally flexible civil commitment, institutional treatment, and step-down treatment standards that allow the appropriate commitment and treatment of individuals with mental illness who pose a danger to others or are living on the streets and cannot care for themselves. And once again, believe you me, that the part of the homeless population that is in that sort of shape and is an actual threat to humanity and the people who are living in those neighborhoods is next to nil. Fighting vagrancy on American streets. There's that vagrancy again. The Attorney General, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, LFK Jr., the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, whoever the hell this idiot is, and the Secretary of Transportation, Sean Doofus, shall take immediate steps to assess their discretionary grant programs and determine whether priority for those grants may be given to grantees in states and municipalities that actively meet the below criteria to the maximum extent permitted by law. Enforcing prohibitions on open illicit drug use, like we don't do that already. Enforce prohibitions on urban camping and loitering. There we go. So the homeless are a bunch of lazy vagrants who just want to sit around and cause trouble in the streets. Enforce prohibitions on urban squatting, as if where are they supposed to go? Enforce and, where necessary, adopt standards that address individuals who are a danger to themselves or others and suffer from serious mental illness or substance use disorder, or who are living on the streets and cannot care for themselves, through assisted outpatient treatment or by moving them into treatment centers or other appropriate facilities via civil commitment or other available means to the maximum extent permitted by law, or substantially implement and comply with, to the extent required, the registration and notification obligations of the Sex Offender Registry and Notification Act. Sounds like the entire Trump cabinet should be listed on this, on the Sex Offender Registry and Notification Act, particularly in the case of registered sex offenders, like Donald Trump, with no fixed address, including it by adequately mapping and checking the location of homeless sex offenders. Now, when was the last time you heard about a homeless sex offender wreaking havoc on American streets? Now, that comes from the White House. The Attorney General shall ensure that homeless individuals, this is Pam Blondie, she's going to do a great job of that. Ensure that homeless individuals are arrested for federal crimes are evaluated consistent with 18 U.S.C. 4248 to determine whether they are sexually dangerous persons and certified accordingly for civil commitment. Take all the necessary steps to ensure the availability of funds under the Emergency Federal Law Enforcement Assistance Program to support, as consistent with 34 U.S.C. 50101 at sequential encampment removal efforts in areas in which public safety is at risk and state and local resources are inadequate. Well, that's just about everywhere. Not the public safety, but the state and local resources, which is another issue with this whole executive order. Assess federal resources to determine whether they may be directed toward ensuring, to the extent permitted by law, that detainees with serious mental illness are not released into the public because of a lack of forensic bed capacity at appropriate local, state, and federal jails or hospitals. I got news for you. There is a lack of forensic bed capacity in all of those places. Enhance requirements at prisons and residential reentry centers that are under the authority of the Attorney General. Pam Blondie, or receive funding from the Attorney General, require in-custody housing release plans, and to the maximum extent practicable, require individuals to comply. Redirecting federal resources toward effective methods of addressing homelessness. Well, we've already done this, as we'll see in a few moments. The Secretary of Health and Human Services, RFK Jr., shall take appropriate action to ensure that discretionary grants issued by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration for Substance Abuse Use Disorder Prevention, Treatment, and Recovery Fund evidence-based programs and do not fund programs that fail to achieve adequate outcomes, including so-called harm reduction or safe consumption efforts that only facilitate illegal drug use and its attendant harm. And there's nothing about current homelessness programs that facilitate illegal drug use or sex offender behavior, for that matter. Provide technical assistance to assisted outpatient treatment programs for individuals with serious mental illness or addiction during and after the civil commitment process, focused on shifting such individuals off of the streets and public programs and into private housing and support networks. We're already doing that. But you don't want to make sure that people get into housing first. Ensure that the federal funds for federally qualified health centers and certified community behavioral health clinics reduce rather than promote homelessness by supporting, to the maximum extent permitted by law, comprehensive services for individuals with serious mental illness and substance abuse disorder, including crisis prevention services. I have more news for you. People do not want to be homeless if they can help it. But this is not what the Trump administration thinks. This is not what MAGA thinks. They think we're all lazy slobs who believe sitting out in a rainstorm in a cardboard box is a wonderful way to live. Increasing accountability and safety in America's homeless programs. Here's the safety thing again. The Secretary of Health and Human Services and the RFK Jr. and the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development shall take appropriate actions to increase accountability in the provision of the grants awarded for homelessness assistance and transitional living programs. Oh, shouldn't we have those first? These actions shall include, to the extent permitted by law, ending support for housing first policies. Well, there you go. Housing first policies are out the window with these jackasses that prioritize accountability and fail to promote treatment, recovery, and self-sufficiency. Baloney. Increasing competition among grantees through broadening the applicant pool and holding grantees to higher standards of effectiveness in reducing homelessness and increasing public safety. And it's not a public safety issue. It is a personal, chronic financial crisis and public health crisis issue. The Secretary of Housing and Urban Development shall, as appropriate, take steps to require recipients of federal housing and homelessness assistance to increase requirements that persons participating in the recipients' programs who suffer from substance use disorder or serious mental illness use substance abuse treatment or mental health services as a condition of participation without respect to housing. And it goes on and on and on. All we need to do is look at the statement from Elizabeth Warren to understand how absolutely detrimental this executive order is to the inroads that have been made toward reducing homelessness in this country. U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren, ranking member of the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, released the following statement on President Trump's executive orders to criminalize homelessness. The nation's homelessness crisis is a symptom of our housing shortage, and President Trump's executive order to criminalize homelessness will make it worse. Cities that have successfully begun to tackle the homelessness crisis show us what works, meeting people where they are, housing them, and providing wraparound services. If the Trump administration actually wanted to reduce homelessness, they would stop taking every opportunity to gut affordable housing programs that help get people off the streets. And in order to further buttress this entire disaster executive order and show exactly what a joke this thing is, all we have to do is go to the horse's mouth. The National Alliance to End Homelessness talks about housing first policies. The Alliance says on their website, the order would impose a multitude of harmful, ineffective, and outdated policies and practices for addressing homelessness. Collectively, they aim to defund and dismantle the foundations of homeless response in the United States, while retreating from the federal government's essential role in supporting communities across the nation. This order represents the most harmful policy proposal on homelessness in my career, said Ann Oliva, CEO of the National Alliance to End Homelessness. at a time when unaddressed housing costs are driving record numbers of people into homelessness. This order demonstrates a lack of focus and understanding on what our communities, both red and blue, need to address this crisis. Instead, it largely focuses on punishing people for being homeless and denying desperately needed funds to overwhelmed and under-resourced frontline workers. Housing First is a thoroughly researched and proven approach to ending people's homelessness by addressing their most essential need first, the need for housing. With housing as a baseline, people are then best able to benefit from quality supportive services, such as healthcare, addiction treatment, and job training. Withdrawing support for Housing First would signal a retreat from evidence and establish best practice, and unnecessarily upend the daily operations of overstretched providers whose work saves lives every single day. This will cause homelessness to increase. The order adopts pledges made in Project 2025, calling on the Secretary of Health and Human Services, RFK Jr., and the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development to change grant award structures and end the support for evidence-based policy and programs, including those that adhere to a Housing First approach. This order calls for reversing policies that prevent the forcible and involuntary commitment of people living with mental illness. A philosophy that took decades to implement in this country when people were once institutionalized against their will for any number of psychiatric conditions, whether they were real or not real. This defies a 26-year settled legal precedent in Olmstead versus LC, the Supreme Court case that guarantees people with disabilities have the right to live in the community with necessary support. Homelessness does not impact all groups the same way, and people with disabilities have greater vulnerabilities when homeless, coupled with the recent cuts to Medicaid and the already scarce access to quality treatment options that both housed and unhoused people need and want. People with disabilities who often experience long-term or recurring homelessness will be treated as disposable. They already are, in large part anyway. The Alliance calls on the Trump administration to direct its enormous resources to strengthen the availability and affordability of mental health services, rather than treating it merely as a problem to be hidden from public view. And this is your good old oligarchy taking charge and front and center here again. You've got all the jackass, the big lawyers in big housing, and all the oligarchies that own all this real estate, including assholes like Donald Trump, who drive the price and cost of housing up and drive the cost of rent up so they can get rich off of people, driving the price of housing and home mortgages into an unsustainable level. So people who are working can't even afford housing and end up out in the streets. They're not druggies, and they don't have any other issues. They're just stuck in a car. The same problem happens with health insurance and the cost of health care. People develop chronic illness, are rejected by the medical system, undergo massive debt, and can no longer afford their housing, go through bankruptcy, and end out in the street. Well, that's not something that Donald Trump thinks is the problem. No, Donald Trump thinks that people who are homeless are all lazy druggies who would rather sniff cocaine than get a real job and grow up and be actual adults. The toddler in the White House, the guy who tells us, cries and whines and complains about every single little stupid insult, is the one telling us that homeless people are a bunch of 15-year-old kids who don't know how to take it upon themselves to be responsible adults. This is an old guard MAGA thinking. An old guard thinking that homelessness, people who are homeless are all vagrants. That goes way back into the 1900s. So, in order to truly explain exactly what it is that Housing First is accomplishing, we have to find what it is, and we have to show exactly how it is benefiting, and show that what Donald Trump is saying, as usual, is a pack of propaganda lies. National Alliance to End Homelessness. Housing First is a thoroughly researched and proven approach to ending people's homelessness by prioritizing their most essential need first, the need for housing. By ending people's homelessness immediately, housing gives them the stability to pursue personal goals and improve their quality of life. Despite the evidence, the executive order moves to adopt guidance that was included in Project 2025. It calls for the Secretaries of Health and Human Services and Housing and Urban Development to change grant award structures and end support for evidence-based policy and programs, including those that adhere to a housing first approach. This change will upend the progress that has been made by across the country. The executive order represents a significant step back to a time when programs are rigid, with high barriers to housing that failed to meet people where they were, and denied the most vulnerable the resource they most desperately need, a rapid reconnection to permanent housing. The administration should follow the model set by the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, which widely credits its successful reduction in veteran homelessness to the adoption of the Housing First approach. This is a clear proof point. When the resources for housing, healthcare, and other supports are sufficiently resourced, Housing First is the most effective and produces the greatest outcomes, while also serving people with dignity and compassion, unlike the Donald Trump dictatorial regime. The dictatorship should listen to the experts and expand the toolbox rather than force communities to rely on fewer and more expensive, ineffective, and harmful approaches. Communities need more resources for permanent solutions, not more administrative burdens, risks, and barriers to doing life-saving work, like people who used to live in the 1940s. So the slow bleed of fascism continues. This is the next step. Once the government is done with the immigrants, they will move on to the weak, disabled, homeless, out on the streets, the useless eaters, the unproductives of society, the undesirables. This whole thing is being set up so that the government has some kind of an excuse, and the people in the administration who are carrying out the ICE raids will then move on and target next the people who can't defend themselves in homeless encampments across America. Make no mistake, this is structured for a reason. And the ICE detention centers that they are now setting up, once they are able to and are successful with taking care of moving the migrants through and kicking them out of this country, what do you think those detention centers are going to be used for next? They're not just being put up there for temporary use. If we don't stop the Trump administration from continuing to erode the pillars of American citizenship, then that is exactly what is going to happen. My name is Scott Schneider, and I'm fed up in Minnesota.